Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomorec.com's website as well as the online classes. In this episode, part 4 of our prophecy series, dating worship. Welcome back to the No More Sea broadcast as we continue our series on prophecy in part 4 with issues concerning dating prophecy. Now, another thing I want to briefly touch upon, unfortunately, it's very difficult to go through all these things, but when we're dealing with prophecy, again, as we said earlier, we say that there is when the prophet actually spoke these things. And that's when it was first said. But then there's a question of time of when it's actually written down. And next, there's a question of when we get the form that we have it today, the final form of the text. And so there's lots of debate about these things. And there's tons of it. And then we have the historicity of each of these things going on. The historicity of, did that person actually exist in history, or is it a literary device in play so that God can communicate a certain message? And does everything have to be 100% historical for God to achieve his purposes? And it gets really dicey. And so scholars go into all that. And so it's very difficult. And so I would urge you to check out all the scholastic debates behind these things, and they're important discussions. But let it not be at the expense of what God intends by his message. So, was there a historical person named Jonah? And when did that historical person live? And how much of what Jonah prophesied is a literary device using prophecy and poetry for God to speak something, and what does he intend upon messaging by that? And must we add to this debate that in order to accept the divinity of Jesus, we have to infer that he must have meant that Jonah is a historical figure and historically was inside the belly of a whale for 72 hours. And all of that means then that Jesus is God. Otherwise, we have to play the game of tying the historicity of Jonah to the historicity of Jesus unnecessarily, thereby limiting ourselves in our discussion. Such poor thinking sets us up for failure where we don't need to bring these discussions to bear. And again, we're not focused on what God intends to message in these things. We get sidetracked in so many issues that are not necessarily in the text that we bring to it inappropriately and then get off track. And so we don't have to tie these things together in that manner when we can see what is intended by the gospel writer when Jesus brings up these things without adding undue stress in the text that's not there, that would not be an issue for the listeners of either Jesus' day or for those who are encountering Jonah's work in its time. Now I wish to clarify that I don't mean to say that these studies are not important or integral to understanding of the text. They're not completely peripheral, but they're not completely paramount in the sense that if we focus on these issues alone to the exclusion of what God intends the message, we're missing the point altogether, because I don't think first century or even those people in the time of Jonah are focusing on these issues specifically to the extent that we do today. They're not discrediting what's being said because we discredit what's being said. They're having their own issues, and if we miss and lose sight of those issues, then we're missing what was intended when these were originally spoken at their time and place appropriately. And who wrote Jonah? Does it necessitate that the prophecy that we have about Jonah necessarily be written by Jonah? And when did Jonah say this? And when was it written down? And how much of the prophecy is predictive? So that Jonah said this on this day, and this happens on this day. And that's another question altogether, because Jonah prophesied in 40 days this city will be destroyed, and it doesn't happen. And that's another question altogether. And so there's so many things going on that we have to consider. The same thing with Daniel. Scholars are divided when to date the book of Daniel. Scholars are divided on whether there was an actual person named Daniel that existed in this time period. They debate that. And so the form of Daniel that we have today, when was it written? Was it written in the time that Daniel is purported to have lived? Or was it later? And there are discussions, good discussions, going on in the academic world on both sides. And the final form of the text that we have, how much of it was from the time of Daniel and how much of it is later, say, perhaps the 2nd century before Christ, before the Common Era. How much of that? The same thing can be said of Job. Was there an actual historical character named Job? These debates go on in scholarship. And when do we date the writing of the book of Job in the form that we have it in our Bibles? And is it merely someone writing Job later on, much like David da Silva has written a book about the Maccabean period, but he wrote that in the 20th, 21st century. But he's writing that novel about a time period that's before Christ, in the 2nd century before Christ, before the Common Era. And so, but he's clearly written it 2,000 years later. And he's writing it as if it occurred. And a thought experiment, and I probably need to reach out to David and ask him, would it would have been interesting if David would have written it in Greek and then translated his own Greek so that it would reflect it in that time period. How he's written this novel, beautiful novel, and yet it's set Maccabean period. But it's written, obviously, 2,000 years later. Over 2,000 years, because it's now, 2nd century before the Common Era, BC, before Christ. And so, did Job write Job? Was there a historical figure named Job that actually existed? And is Job one of the oldest books of the Bible that we have? These are all debated by scholars, and they are good arguments to go through and discern these things. Same thing with Isaiah. How many Isaiahs do we have? The prophecies of Isaiah for some scholars, cover 3 different periods. And so does necessitate that there be one Isaiah from the 8th century that wrote all of what we have of Isaiah today. Was all of what we have in the final form of the text of Isaiah today, was all of that written in the 8th century by a guy named Isaiah? Or we get into the debate in the New Testament period with Paul. How many of the letters that we have, the writings in the New Testament, did Paul write? Tradition has him doing 14, including the Epistle of Hebrews. Is that true? Can we honestly think that Paul wrote all those? How much of it needs to be written by Paul? Well, Paul had secretaries. He had amanuenses, so that they wrote in their Greek style what Paul wanted. So what Paul intended and what God by the Holy Spirit intended Paul to do gets channeled through an amanuensis that has his own style of Greek. Or her, maybe, who knows, but most likely men, but who knows. And so are some of these letters, not physically written by the hand of Paul? That's probably true. Again, go through the academic debates on these. Go through the scholars and see where they debate on which Paul letters, writings can we attribute to Paul, whereby Paul is alive and speaking to someone, and they're writing what Paul wants written, and then Paul approves it and signs it with his own hand. Could any of it be written by someone after Paul passed away, which was a common practice in that time period? Could any of it have been written later by someone else? And if so, could God allow that to be used by his Holy Spirit and the church receive it and it be a part of our New Testament? The same thing goes on with Isaiah. The same thing happens when we discuss about Isaiah. And does it necessitate that we fight hard to prove that there's only one Isaiah? Or that there's multiple Isaiahs? And how many are there? And do we have to get lost in those debates and we never do get down to what Isaiah, the messaging that God had intended by the writings associated with Isaiah? Do we lose sight of what God intended? Can later generations take the prophecies of Isaiah or the writings or sermons of Paul? Can any later group of people do that? And how late can you go with those? So you get caught up in all the datings and you get caught up on all who wrote what. Does Isaiah need to be writing, or does he have people writing for him like Paul? These are all debates that get into it. And, we've highlighted Dr. Heiser many times, and he has done, we recently have highlighted a podcast, his podcast. And there are episodes on the writings of Isaiah and dating them and Job. And he has discussed at length that there is an impasse in scholarship between the writings of Daniel. And if you have done anything with Dr. Heiser's podcast and his use of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation, he does at times go into how if Daniel is able to be placed in the 2nd century rather than in the 6th century, then if Daniel's in the 2nd century, then we could, go that route. And there are debates on, who those 4 kingdoms are in the book of Daniel. And, who do you make those 4 to be, depending on how you date the book of Daniel and depending on how you decide what Daniel's referents are. And those are all discussions that are out there. And I'm only introducing those in this episode. I only want to introduce all that just to say that if we understand prophecy as predictive, then yes, we need Isaiah to be in a certain time period, him saying these things. And then we want him to have said those things and then to be written down so that later on, when the prophecy is fulfilled, then we can say, well, see, it was written down. And some people will go so far as to say that Daniel is carrying a scroll of Isaiah and presents it to Cyrus and say, see, this scroll was written down over 150 years ago, written down by a guy named Isaiah, and you have fulfilled them. And we use that to say that, see, our Bible, the Holy Scriptures that we have, are authentic because God spoke these things century and a half early, and they happen. And Daniel can then take that scroll to a guy named Cyrus and say, see, this was written. And, we add all these wonderful things to the narrative that are not in the Bible. Much like thinking that Hebrew is the original language, and people like Adam and Eve that were historical. And again, do they have to be historical? And again, go back to the scholastic debates on those things. And I'm not here to say that these people are or are not historical people. I'm not here to debate that. I'm just here to introduce to you that the world of scholarship out there has opened it up And it's wide open for you to go study all the debates on whether Adam and Eve are historical or not, and whether that means that the Bible is true or not. Because I think in many cases, whether or not these are historical or whether they are literary devices does not matter, ultimately, on whether we can trust the Bible or not. And there are arguments on both sides, debating the historicity of a single Isaiah or multiple Isaiahs. And the same thing, there are good arguments on both sides on whether Daniel is early or late. And so when we deal with prophecy and we say it has to be predictive, then we shut down some of those, and we have to then say, no, Daniel has to be a historical figure who lived in the 5th, 6th century. 6th century Daniel lived in that time period, and it was written in that time period by Daniel, and it has to be that. And Job was, we have apologists. Job is the oldest scriptures we have. Is that true? And how old, when can you date the book of Job then? So all those enter into the discussion. And when we start being honest with the data points that are available to us and the academic discussions that are going on, and when we get honest with those things, then we can have a much better discussion. But at the same time, I don't want those debates to crowd out God's messaging. And that's, for me, what happens. If we entirely spend our time arguing over whether or not, Daniel's early or late, maybe it's both and. Maybe there are portions that are early and are reflexive of an oral tradition that date back to an original Daniel, and there are portions that are late. It's a both and, maybe. Maybe that's possible, because there's good arguments on both sides. Maybe it's a both and then. Maybe it is preserving some things. And the same thing for Job. Is Job early or late? Was there actually a person named Job? Did he exist? And Jonah and Daniel and whatnot. And then, Jesus said, did Jesus, by saying that, did he mean to put his stamp of approval on that? When he says Moses said, Moses wrote, is that Jesus using first century ideology and speaking as a first century Jew would in the first century? Would he, is it just first century Judaism that he's a part of, and what they understood and how they spoke and how they thought? Is he just speaking in their language and using their understanding? Or is he putting his actual stamp of approval on these things? That's the debate, and they're there. And so, thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes in videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.